I looked up at the wall clock because I already knew what it would say before my eyes reached it. 1 more minute. My husband had never been obsessed with routines when we first met. He forgot birthdays, left coffee mugs in strange places, and once drove 30 miles in the wrong direction because he was too busy telling me about an article he'd read on deep-sea creatures. But somehow, for the last 8 months, every single night had become identical. At exactly 11 o'clock, he would stand up. He would grab the same dark grey hoodie. He would kiss my forehead. Then he'd smile with just enough warmth to make the lie sound believable. I just need some fresh air. And every single night, he disappeared. For 47 minutes. Not 40. Not an hour. 47. The first few times I believed him. Then I became curious. Then concerned. Eventually, I became afraid. My name is Emily. I'm 38 years old, and until that night I believed that every marriage was built on trust. I was about to learn that sometimes trust survives the truth. And sometimes the truth saves something you didn't even know was dying. But this story doesn't start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Before we go any further, drop your first name and your city in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. I read more comments than you probably think, and it's always amazing to see where everyone is listening from. Now let me tell you what happened. When Daniel and I got married, we weren't one of those couples who promised perfection. We promised honesty. That mattered more. I met him when I was 29. He was 31. An architect with messy handwriting, terrible dancing, and the strange habit of apologizing to furniture whenever he accidentally bumped into it. "You okay, chair?" he'd say. I laughed every single time. I worked as a pediatric physical therapist. Most of my days were spent helping children learn movements their parents feared they might never master. Progress happened in millimeters. A finger lifting. 1 extra step. 5 more seconds standing without support. It taught me patience. Daniel admired that. He used to tell people I measured success differently than anyone he'd ever met. Emily celebrates things nobody else notices. Maybe that was true. Maybe that's why I noticed him changing before anyone else would have. Our life wasn't glamorous. We owned a modest 2-story house with a tiny backyard, where nothing except rosemary seemed willing to grow. Every Saturday morning, Daniel made pancakes. Every Sunday evening, we watched documentaries neither of us finished, because one of us always fell asleep halfway through. It wasn't exciting. It was steady. At least, it had been. The change began after his father died. Not dramatically. Quietly. His father, Richard, was 72. Heart failure. Fast enough that none of us expected it. Slow enough that everyone carried guilt afterward. Daniel blamed himself for not visiting more often. His younger sister blamed herself for arguing with him 2 weeks earlier. His mother blamed the doctors. Grief always wants someone to accuse. For Daniel, grief became silence. He started sleeping less. Eating less. Smiling less. Sometimes I'd wake up at 2 in the morning and find him standing at the kitchen window, staring into complete darkness. "What are you looking at?" "I don't know." That answer frightened me more than if he'd said ghosts. Then, exactly 3 months after the funeral, the 11 o'clock walks began. At first I appreciated them. Fresh air. Exercise. Time to think. Those all sounded healthy. When I asked whether I should come with him, he smiled gently. "I think I need to do this alone." That sounded reasonable. Everyone processes grief differently. I reminded myself of that constantly. Weeks passed. Then months. Patterns emerged. Always 11. Always alone. Always 47 minutes. Always returning slightly calmer than when he'd left. One evening, I jokingly asked why he always came back after exactly 47 minutes. He froze. Only for half a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. I guess that's just how long my route takes. It wasn't convincing. Not because of the words. Because Daniel had never been a man who measured life by routines. Now suddenly, everything was measured. His shoes always placed perfectly beside the door. Phone fully charged. Keys in left pocket. Wallet never taken. That last detail bothered me. Where was he walking? That required no money. Another month passed. I tried not to become suspicious. Suspicion changes people before it ever discovers anything. You stop hearing answers. You only hear evidence. I refused to become that wife. Instead, I watched. One evening I noticed dirt on his sneakers. Red clay. Not ordinary sidewalk dust. Real soil. The next night. No dirt. The night after. Again. Red clay. There wasn't any red clay near our neighborhood. At least none I knew about. I almost asked. Instead, I washed the shoes. As I rinsed them beneath warm water, I noticed something caught inside one tread. A tiny white flower. Barely larger than my thumbnail. I placed it on a paper towel. By morning, it had already wilted. Somehow, that tiny flower disturbed me more than lipstick ever could have. Flowers mean somewhere. Some destination. Some purpose. Fresh air doesn't leave flowers inside your shoes. Around that time, Daniel's mother started making comments. Margaret was 68. She wasn't cruel. She was practical to the point that emotions sometimes sounded like inconveniences. He seems distant. He's grieving. It's been almost a year. There isn't a schedule. I know, but people still have responsibilities. She stirred her tea slowly. You know, Richard used to disappear at night too. I looked up. What? Though? She frowned. I thought Daniel told you. Told me what? She shook her head. Nothing important. When someone says that, it is almost always important. What do you mean? She hesitated. After Daniel's older brother died, Richard walked every night. I felt something tighten inside me. Daniel had an older brother. Michael. He died before I met the family. Car accident. Age 17. Nobody talked about him much. Not because they didn't love him. Because the grief had settled into the walls of that family decades ago. Margaret sighed. Your father-in-law would leave every night around 11. My heartbeat accelerated. Why? He never explained. Where did he go? I never followed him. The sentence stayed with me. I never followed him. Not because it answered anything. Because suddenly, I wondered if I was making the same decision. For another 2 weeks, I did nothing. Then came Tuesday. Rain all afternoons. Cold enough that the streets emptied early. At 10:58, Daniel stood. Grey hoodie. Running shoes. Forehead kiss. I'll be back. I smiled. Okay. The front door closed. I counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. By 20. I grabbed my coat. The rain had softened into mist. Perfect weather to disappear inside. I stayed half a block behind him. He walked confidently. Not like someone wandering. Like someone following directions he'd memorized. Left, right, across the small bridge over Miller Creek. Past the closed bakery. Into an older neighborhood where streetlights stood farther apart. I kept expecting him to turn toward someone's house. He didn't. He continued walking until the pavement ended. Beyond it, an old service road stretched into darkness. My stomach tightened. Fresh air. Sure. The road eventually reached an abandoned community garden that had been closed years earlier after funding disappeared. I'd driven past it dozens of times. Never entered. Daniel climbed over the damaged wooden gate. I waited. Counted to 10. Then climbed over myself. The garden looked forgotten. Raised planting beds. Broken fences. Weeds. Rusting tools. Moonlight reflected off puddles left by the rain. I crouched behind an overgrown hedge. Daniel wasn't alone. An elderly man stood waiting beside one of the garden plots. They shook hands. No, not shook. Held. Like old friends. Then another person arrived. A woman. Then another. Then another. Within 5 minutes, 9 people stood in a rough circle. Different ages. Different backgrounds. Nobody looked dangerous. Nobody looked secretive. They looked sad. Daniel spoke first. His voice carried gently through the damp night. Who wants to start tonight? Silence. Finally, an older woman stepped forward. My son answered my text today. Everyone smiled. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like people celebrating something fragile. She continued. He only wrote 4 words. Daniel nodded. What were they? I'm still trying, Mom. She began crying. Nobody rushed toward her. Nobody interrupted. They simply stayed. Daniel listened with complete attention. No advice. No speeches. Just listening. One by one. Everyone shared something. A relapse avoided. An apology received. A panic attack survived. A lonely birthday endured. I realized this wasn't an affair. It wasn't gambling. It wasn't drugs. It wasn't anything I had imagined. It was a support group, but not an official one. There were no pamphlets, no therapist, no building, just broken garden beds beneath the night sky. Then Daniel spoke. I almost didn't come tonight. Someone asked why. He smiled sadly. Because pretending everything is okay at home gets harder every week. The words hit me like ice. Pretending. Was our entire marriage pretending? I don't want Emily to worry. Someone answered gently. Maybe she already does. Daniel stared toward the ground. I know. Silence settled again. Finally, he whispered something that broke my heart. I just don't know how to explain that I'm helping people, because I still haven't figured out how to help myself. I forgot to breathe. Everything I thought I knew shifted. And then, someone behind me stepped on a branch. The sharp crack echoed through the empty garden. 9 heads turned at exactly the same moment. Including my husband's. Daniel's eyes found mine almost instantly. Not because I was standing in the open. I wasn't. Half my body was still hidden behind the overgrown hedge. But after 12 years together, he had always been able to recognize the smallest movement I made. A shift of weight, the way I tucked loose hair behind my ear, the rhythm of my breathing when I was nervous. For a second, neither of us moved. The rain tapped softly against old wooden planter boxes. Someone in the circle quietly asked, "Do you know her?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. His shoulders dropped, as though he'd been carrying something heavy for months and had finally decided to set it down. "That's my wife." Nobody gasped. Nobody exchanged suspicious looks. Instead, every face turned toward me with the same expression. Concern. Not because I'd discovered them, Because they realized I hadn't known. Daniel took 3 slow steps toward me. I think you can come out now. There wasn't any point pretending anymore. I walked around the hedge, suddenly feeling embarrassed, like I'd interrupted a private conversation. I'm sorry, I said quietly. I followed you. I know. I thought. I know what you thought. His voice wasn't angry. That somehow made me feel worse. The older gentleman who had greeted Daniel earlier smiled gently. I'll give you two some space. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked at me. If she's here now, she deserves the whole truth. The group remained where they were, giving us privacy without actually leaving. It was one of those strange acts of kindness you only recognize after you've seen enough pain. Daniel folded his hands together. Do you remember my brother Michael? I nodded. I know how he died. You know how he died. He swallowed. You don't know what happened afterward. I stayed silent. My father blamed himself. I know. So did my mother. I know. He looked past me toward the empty entrance gate. What nobody ever talks about is that I blamed myself too. I frowned. You were only 12. I know. You couldn't have stopped a car accident. I know. His voice cracked for the first time. But 12-year-olds don't think like adults. He laughed once. Without humor. When you're 12, you don't understand probability. You understand promises. I felt my chest tighten. The night before Michael died. Daniel stopped. He looked toward the ground for several seconds before continuing. We were supposed to build a model airplane together. Instead, Daniel had gone to a friend's birthday party. Michael had gone out alone. The accident happened less than an hour later. For 30 years, Daniel whispered, one part of my brain has believed that if I had stayed home, somehow things would have been different. I reached for his hand. He let me hold it. I know that isn't logical. I've spent years telling myself that. I've spent years believing therapists. I've spent years reading books. But guilt isn't interested in evidence. Nobody in the circle interrupted. Not once. One woman quietly wiped away tears. The elderly man stared toward the ground, as though hearing his own story again. Daniel continued. When Dad started taking those night walks after Michael died. He smiled sadly. I eventually figured out where he went. The garden. He nodded. It wasn't abandoned then. He looked around us. It was just neglected. My father started meeting one man whose daughter had died. Then another woman whose husband had taken his own life. Then another person. It became... He searched for the word. A place where nobody had to explain why they weren't okay. I looked around again. The broken garden suddenly looked different. Not abandoned. Protected. When Dad got sick. Daniel continued. He asked me for one thing. What? He asked me not to let the meetings disappear. The sentence hung quietly between us. I wanted to tell you. I really did. Every night. But then I imagined how strange it sounded. Honey, I'm leaving the house every night to meet strangers in an abandoned garden. He smiled weakly. I convinced myself I'd explain it tomorrow. Then tomorrow became 8 months. I realized something then. The lie hadn't started because he didn't trust me. It had continued because every additional day made telling the truth harder. A woman around my age stepped forward. My name is Teresa. She smiled softly. Daniel probably won't tell you this. So I will. She folded her arms against the cold. My husband died 18 months ago. I stopped speaking to almost everyone. I stopped answering calls. I stopped eating properly. I honestly wasn't sure I wanted to keep living. She glanced toward Daniel. He knocked on my door every Wednesday for 6 weeks. I never answered. The 7th week, I finally opened it. She laughed quietly. He handed me soup. Didn't say anything. Just soup. Several people smiled. He came back the next week. And the next. He never asked me to be okay. He just made sure I wasn't alone. She looked directly at me. Your husband saved my life. Before I could respond, the elderly man cleared his throat. My turn. He extended his hand toward me. I'm Arthur. I'm 76. When my wife developed Alzheimer's. He stopped. Even now the words were difficult. Our friends slowly disappeared. Not because they were bad people. They just didn't know what to say. He looked toward Daniel. This young man sat with me every Thursday for nearly a year. We hardly talked. But empty silence feels different when someone chooses to share it. My eyes filled with tears. Not because I was sad. Because I suddenly understood why Daniel always returned home calmer. He wasn't escaping our marriage. He was carrying pieces of other people's grief. Then carrying his own. I looked at him. Why didn't you let me help? He answered immediately. Because you're already helping people all day. You spend your career carrying children and families through impossible moments. I didn't want to bring more pain home. I laughed through tears. You brought the silence home instead. He closed his eyes. I know. I'm sorry. Those 2 words carried months of exhaustion. I stepped closer. I'm angry. I know. I'm hurt. I know. But I'm more relieved than angry. His forehead rested against mine. I was terrified you'd leave. I almost smiled. I followed you because I thought you might already be leaving. For the first time that night. He laughed. A real laugh. Small, but genuine. Behind us, Arthur clapped his hands once. So, everyone turned. Do we cancel tonight? Daniel looked at me. I squeezed his hand. No. He frowned. What? They were here before I arrived. They shouldn't lose tonight because of us. He searched my face, almost asking for permission. I nodded. Go. I'll stay. That night I sat on an overturned planter, while people shared stories that would never appear on social media. No dramatic recoveries. No miraculous endings. One man celebrated 93 days without drinking. A college student admitted she'd finally answered her father's phone call after ignoring him for 3 months. A retired nurse confessed she still dreamed about patients she'd lost during the pandemic. Every story ended the same way. Not with applause. Not with advice. With one sentence. Thank you for telling us. I realized how rarely adults hear those words. Around 11:46 the meeting ended. Exactly 1 minute later, people began leaving in different directions. No schedule. No paperwork. No membership cards. Just quiet goodbyes. As Daniel and I walked home together, neither of us spoke for almost 10 minutes. Eventually I broke the silence. 47 minutes. He smiled. My father believed that if meetings lasted longer than 47 minutes, and people started trying to fix each other, and before 47, they often never reached the important part. So he timed it. I laughed. That's oddly specific. He was oddly specific. We reached the bridge over Miller Creek. Daniel stopped walking. I'll answer anything. So ask. I thought carefully. There were dozens of questions. Only one mattered most. Are there any more lies? His answer came without hesitation. No. I watched his face. Not searching for deception. Searching for fear. There wasn't any. Only relief. I believe you. He nodded once. I know trusting me again won't happen overnight. No, it won't. But tonight isn't where we start over. It's where we stop pretending. When we reached our front door, the clock in the hallway read 11:58. For the first time in 8 months, he hadn't come home alone. The next morning felt strangely ordinary. The coffee maker still made its usual clicking sound before brewing. The neighbor's golden retriever still barked at the mail truck. The newspaper still landed just a little too close to the flower bed. It amazed me how the world could continue exactly as it had the day before when, inside our house, everything had quietly changed. Daniel came into the kitchen wearing the same grey hoodie from the night before. For months I had associated that hoodie with secrets. Now I saw coffee stains near the pocket, a loose thread on one sleeve, and a tiny smear of dried soil near the cuff. It wasn't the hoodie of a man living a double life. It was the hoodie of a man carrying burdens he never thought he could share. He poured himself coffee. I didn't sleep much. I know. You either. I smiled faintly. I kept replaying everything. He nodded. So did I. There was an awkwardness between us, not because we were strangers, but because honesty has a strange way of making people feel exposed before it makes them feel close. Finally, Daniel said, "Ask me anything." I looked at him. Everything. Everything. How long have you been seeing a therapist? He looked surprised. Almost 3 years. I blinked. You've been in therapy? Yes. You never told me. I know. Why? He looked embarrassed. I kept thinking I'd only need a few sessions. Then a few became a few dozen. I felt ashamed. I reached across the table. Daniel. He met my eyes. You know what I tell the parents at work when their children need help? He nodded. Asking for help is progress, not failure. I smiled sadly. You believe that for everyone except yourself. He laughed quietly. Apparently. That conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Longer than any serious conversation we'd had in years. There wasn't a dramatic confession waiting at the end. No second family. No hidden debt. No affair. Just dozens of little fears that had quietly piled up because neither of us had realized the other one was carrying them. By lunchtime, I understood something uncomfortable. Daniel hadn't been the only one hiding things. I admitted I had spent months imagining impossible scenarios, instead of telling him how frightened I had become. I didn't want to sound controlling. He shook his head. And I didn't want to sound broken. We sat there for a while. 2 decent people. Both trying to protect the other. Both accidentally creating distance instead. Sometimes love doesn't fail because people stop caring. Sometimes it fails because they care so much that they edit themselves. That afternoon my phone rang. It was Margaret. How are you? There was something careful about her voice. Almost cautious. I know. Silence. You know. I followed him. Another silence. Longer this time. You found the gardens. Yes. Margaret sighed so deeply, I could almost hear 30 years leaving her lungs. He finally showed someone. He didn't mean to. I suppose not. I hesitated. Did you really never follow Richard? No. Why? I almost did. What stopped you? She thought for several seconds. I was afraid. Of what? That I'd discover he didn't need me anymore. The honesty caught me off guard. She continued. When you've been married for decades, you begin confusing privacy with rejection. I convinced myself that if Richard wanted me there, and he would ask. He never did. So I stopped wondering. Her voice softened. Looking back, I think he was waiting for me to ask. I closed my eyes. That sentence hurt. Not because of Richard. Because I could see how easily Daniel, and I might have repeated the exact same pattern for another 20 years. Margaret surprised me again. Would it be all right if I came tonight? I smiled. I don't think it's my invitation to give. No, it isn't. But maybe you could ask Daniel. That evening, just before 11, Daniel stood from the couch. For the first time in months, he didn't reach automatically for his hoodie. Instead, he looked at me. I'm going. I know. Would you like to come? The question mattered more than the answer. I smiled. Not tonight. He looked worried. Really? Really? I think tonight belongs to them. And I walked over and kissed him. I trust where you're going. His shoulders relaxed. You have no idea what that means. I think I do. As he reached the door, I added, your mother called. He stopped. Though, she wants to come someday. His eyes widened. Then filled. I never thought she'd ask. I don't think she knew she could. He nodded slowly. I'll talk to her. Exactly at 11, he walked out the front door. For the first time, I didn't watch the clock. Instead, I picked up the novel I'd been trying to finish for 6 months. 47 minutes later, the front door opened. I hadn't counted. That felt like healing. Not dramatic. Just quiet. Over the next several weeks, little things changed. Daniel started telling me stories from the garden. Never names. Never private details. Just enough that I understood where his heart had been each night. I'd tell him about a little boy at the clinic who had finally managed 6 independent steps. He'd tell me someone in the group had celebrated an entire month without a panic attack. Neither achievement made headlines. Both deserved celebration. One Saturday, he asked if I'd help clean up the old community garden. When we arrived, about 15 people were already there. Arthur was repairing a fence. Teresa was planting tomatoes. Someone else had brought paint. Another person was replacing broken benches. The place that had looked abandoned the first night now looked like a promise. As I knelt beside one of the flower beds, Arthur smiled. Do you know what? This place wasn't built to grow vegetables. I laughed. It wasn't. Oh, sure. They're nice. But that's never been the harvest. I looked around. People were laughing, working, talking, some in silence, some with tears, some with hope. Arthur placed another plant into the soil. The real harvest has always been people leaving a little lighter than they arrived. I never forgot that sentence. By autumn, the garden had become beautiful. Not perfect. Beautiful. There were still cracked pathways. Still old fences. Still uneven ground. But flowers grew between them. Sometimes healing doesn't replace the broken parts. It grows around them. One evening, about 3 months after I followed Daniel, there was a knock at our front door. A young man stood outside. Maybe 25. Nervous. Is Daniel here? He is. Daniel came to the door. The young man looked at him for several seconds before speaking. I don't know if you remember me. Daniel smiled apologetically. I'm sorry. I remember your face. I can't remember your name. Ethan. Recognition appeared instantly. Ethan. The young man laughed. You remembered eventually. I did. Daniel invited him inside. Instead, Ethan shook his head. I can't stay. He held out an envelope. I wanted to give you this. Daniel frowned. What's this? A wedding invitation. Daniel looked genuinely confused. Ethan smiled. 3 years ago. I met you on a park bench. You talked to me for almost 2 hours. I never told you. But that night I had planned to end my life. Daniel's face went completely still. You changed your mind. Ethan nodded. You didn't convince me. You just stayed. He laughed through tears. Turns out that was enough. He pointed to the invitation. I'm getting married in October. I wanted someone there who met the version of me I almost became. After Ethan left, Daniel sat quietly on the front steps holding the envelope. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally he whispered, almost to himself. My father would have liked him. I sat beside him. I think your father would have been proud of you. He looked at the invitation again. For once, he didn't argue. October arrived with cool mornings and trees that seemed determined to turn every shade of gold before winter claimed them. Life settled into something that felt familiar again. Not because everything had been fixed. Because nothing was being hidden anymore. That turned out to be a much stronger foundation than pretending everything was perfect. Daniel still went to the garden 3 nights a week. Not 7. 3. The other evenings he stayed home. Sometimes we'd cook together. Sometimes we'd sit on the back porch doing absolutely nothing, except listening to the wind move through the maple tree behind our fence. Months earlier, I would have worried that silence meant distance. Now I understood that silence could also mean peace. One Friday afternoon, my clinic held its annual family appreciation event. Parents brought grandparents, siblings, and friends to celebrate the children's progress. There were balloons tied to folding chairs, homemade cookies that disappeared within minutes, and a slideshow showing tiny milestones most people outside our profession would never understand. A little girl named Ava walked 18 steps without assistance. Her mother cried. Her father laughed and cried at the same time. The entire room applauded. As I watched them, I realized something. Healing is almost always invisible until one day it suddenly isn't. Those 18 steps had been built on thousands of tiny attempts nobody had celebrated. That evening, I told Daniel about it. He smiled. Arthur says the same thing. Though, he says nobody notices roots growing. They only notice flowers. I laughed. I like Arthur's. So do I. A week later, Margaret called again. I spoke to Daniel. And he invited me. She sounded almost frightened. I don't know if I belong there. I answered gently. I don't think anyone feels like they belong there the first time. She was quiet. Then she asked, would you come with me? I will. The following Tuesday, the 3 of us walked to the garden together. Margaret moved more slowly than either of us. Not because of age. Because every step carried 30 years of memories. When we reached the old gate, she stopped. This looks smaller than I imagined. Daniel smiled. It did for me too. Arthur was the first to notice us. He walked over with the careful pace of someone whose knees reminded him daily that he was 76. He looked at Margaret for a long moment. Then he smiled. You must be Richard's wife. Margaret's eyes filled instantly. How did you know? Arthur chuckled. He talked about you every single week. She blinked. He did. Oh, constantly. He worried you worked too hard. He admired how stubborn you were. He said you made the best apple pie in 3 counties. Margaret laughed through tears. He actually said that. Arthur nodded. Repeatedly. She covered her mouth. For 30 years. I thought he came here because he needed a life away from me. Arthur shook his head gently. No, he came here so he could be strong enough to go back home. Daniel looked away, giving his mother a little privacy. Margaret whispered something I barely heard. I wish I'd asked. Arthur's answer stayed with me long after that night. So did Richard. There wasn't blame in his voice. Only compassion. Sometimes the saddest stories aren't about people who stopped loving each other. They're about people who never realized the question they needed to ask. Margaret attended quietly that evening. She didn't speak until nearly the end. When she finally did, her voice trembled. My husband died almost 2 years ago. Everyone waited. I've been angry with him. She looked around the circle. For leaving. For getting sick. For taking these walks. She smiled sadly. Tonight, I realized I wasn't angry. I was lonely. Nobody rushed to comfort her. Nobody interrupted. Just like every other story. They let her finish. When we walked home afterward, she slipped her arm through Daniel's. Something I hadn't seen her do since the funeral. I think your father tricked us. Daniel looked confused. What do you mean? He spent 30 years building a family. And another family. Daniel frowned. A family. Margaret smiled toward the garden behind us. People don't have to share blood to carry each other. That winter, snow arrived earlier than usual. The garden meetings moved into an old church basement after one of the local congregations offered the space free of charge. The group remained intentionally small. No advertisements. No social media pages. Just people inviting people who genuinely needed somewhere safe to tell the truth. Daniel asked if I'd help organize donated blankets and coffee. I agreed. Not because he needed me. Because now I understood what the place had become. One evening, while arranging folding chairs, Teresa walked over. Do you know what? I was angry with you. I blinked. With me. She laughed. Not personally. I was jealous. Why? Because Daniel always talked about his wife. I smiled. He did. Oh, constantly. He'd say things like, Emily would know what to do with this situation. Emily once told me. Emily reminds me that healing takes repetition. She laughed again. I started wondering whether you actually existed. I couldn't help laughing. And when I finally met you. She shrugged. I realized something. What? You weren't competing with this place. You were the reason he could keep coming back to it. That thought stayed with me all the way home. Love isn't always visible in grand gestures. Sometimes it appears in the quiet confidence someone carries into the world because they know there's a safe place waiting when they return. Spring arrived. The garden reopened. New flowers covered the beds we'd repaired months earlier. Children from the neighborhood occasionally wandered through with their parents. Most had no idea what had happened there on Tuesday and Thursday nights. To them, it was simply a pretty community garden. In a way, I liked that. Not every meaningful place needs a sign explaining why it matters. One Saturday afternoon, the town council organized a ceremony recognizing volunteers who had contributed to community projects over the previous year. Daniel almost didn't attend. I don't really like public recognition. I know. It makes me uncomfortable. I know. So why are we going? I smiled. Because sometimes accepting gratitude is also an act of generosity. He rolled his eyes. That sounds like something you'd say. It probably is. The community center filled with families, teachers, firefighters, nurses, and volunteers from dozens of local organizations. Nobody expected Daniel's name. Least of all Daniel. Near the end of the ceremony, the mayor stepped to the microphone. There is one recognition that wasn't originally on today's program. The room grew quiet. Over the last year, we've received multiple letters describing acts of kindness that were never intended to become public. The mayor unfolded a piece of paper. Different writers, different stories. One names. Daniel looked at me. Confused. The mayor continued. Some letters described someone sitting beside grieving strangers. Others described delivering meals without asking for credit. Others mentioned rebuilding a neglected community garden that has quietly become a place of hope. Daniel slowly realized where this was going. His first instinct was to sink lower in his chair. Mine was to squeeze his hand. The Community Quiet Service Award goes to Daniel Carter. For several seconds, he didn't move. I whispered, "You should probably stand." "I really don't want to." "I know. But they're clapping for a reason." He walked to the stage looking exactly like the man I'd married. Awkward, humbled, slightly embarrassed by attention. The mayor handed him the plaque. "Would you like to say a few words?" Daniel stared at the audience. Hundreds of faces. Some familiar. Some not. He smiled softly. "I don't think I deserve an award." A few people laughed. "I've learned something over the last few years." He paused. "The people everyone calls strong, and usually aren't. They're just the people who finally admitted they couldn't carry everything alone." The room became very quiet. If this plaque belongs anywhere, it belongs in the garden. Because nobody heals there by themselves. He thanked everyone and stepped away from the microphone. No dramatic speech. No standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Just honest words. As we drove home, the plaque rested on the back seat. Daniel looked at it through the rearview mirror. "It still feels strange." "What does?" "Being seen." I reached over and took his hand. "Maybe. But sometimes quiet people deserve to be noticed too." He smiled. For the first time since Richard's death. The smile reached his eyes. Years have passed since that night. Long enough for memories to soften around the edges. Long enough for some of the people from those first meetings to move away, begin new chapters, or simply discover that they no longer needed the circle quite as often. Arthur passed away 2 winters later. He was 78. He didn't die dramatically. He died exactly the way he had lived for the last several years, quietly, with dignity, surrounded by people who knew him well. At his memorial service, there weren't many expensive flower arrangements. There weren't famous names. There weren't television cameras or newspaper reporters. There were simply people. Teachers, mechanics, nurses, students, widows, veterans, parents, children, people whose lives had crossed his because, at one point or another, he had chosen to stay instead of walking away. Near the end of the service, Arthur's granddaughter stepped to the front holding a folded piece of paper. "My grandfather wrote this a few months ago," she said. "He asked me to read it if he wasn't here to do it himself." The room became completely still. She unfolded the paper. "If you're listening to this, it means I've finally stopped pretending my knees were ever going to get better." A few people laughed softly. That sounded exactly like Arthur. She continued, "Don't waste time wondering whether your life mattered. You almost never get to see the full result of your kindness. Most seeds spend a long time underground." I felt Daniel squeeze my hand. Those words sounded like something Arthur had been teaching us from the beginning. The granddaughter smiled through tears. "If the garden is still open, keep opening the gate." Nothing more. Just that. Keep opening the gate. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Daniel drove to the garden without saying a word. I went with him. The place was empty. The flowers had already begun preparing for spring. The old wooden bench Arthur had repaired years earlier was still there. Daniel sat down. "I still expect him to walk through that gate." "I know. He always arrived 8 minutes early." I smiled. "And complained about being late." Daniel laughed. He did. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked toward the entrance. When I first started coming here after Dad died, I thought this place existed to help broken people. He shook his head. I was wrong. What do you mean? It exists to remind people they were never as alone as they imagined. That sentence stayed with me, because I realized it described far more than the garden. It described marriages, families, friendships, communities. Sometimes loneliness isn't caused by the absence of people. Sometimes it's caused by the absence of honesty. A few months later, something happened that brought everything full circle. One Tuesday evening, about 10 minutes before the meeting started, there was a hesitant knock on the garden gate. A young woman stood outside. Maybe 22. She looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. She held the gate with both hands as though she wasn't sure whether she should enter. Daniel walked over. Hi. She looked embarrassed. I think I'm in the wrong place. What are you looking for? She looked down at a crumpled piece of paper. My therapist wrote this address. Daniel smiled. Then you're probably exactly where you're supposed to be. She looked around. I thought there'd be. She searched for the right word. Zimor. Daniel understood immediately. No office. No reception desk. No sign. She nodded. Yeah. He opened the gate. We only have coffee. She laughed for the first time. I like coffee. As she stepped inside, I suddenly remembered myself standing behind that hedge years earlier, certain I was about to uncover betrayal. Instead, I had uncovered compassion. The meeting that night began exactly the way it always had. Who wants to start? The young woman looked terrified. Nobody pressured her. Nobody pointed at her. 40 minutes later, just before the meeting ended, she quietly raised her hand. My name is Chloe. She stopped, then started again. My name is Chloe. I haven't told anyone this before. Everyone waited. Not impatiently. Patiently. When she finished speaking almost 10 minutes later, there wasn't applause. There wasn't advice. Arthur's chair was empty now. But somehow I could still hear his voice. Daniel smiled gently. Thank you for telling us. Those 4 words seemed to lift something from her shoulders. As everyone left that night, Chloe stopped beside me. Can I ask you something? Of course. Were you always part of this group? I smiled. No, I found it by accident. She laughed. Best accident ever. I looked toward Daniel, who was locking the garden gate. Without question. On the drive home, I stared out the passenger window at the empty streets. Almost instinctively, I looked at the dashboard clock. 11:47. Daniel noticed. You looked. I did. What were you thinking? I smiled. I was thinking how strange it is. What? There was a time when 11:47 meant fear. I reached for his hand. Now it means you're home. People often ask me whether I regret following him that night. The answer surprises them. No, I don't regret following him. But not for the reason most people expect. I don't regret it because it forced us to stop living inside assumptions. Assumptions are quiet. They're polite. They're patient. They build invisible walls one small brick at a time, until 2 people who genuinely love each other find themselves speaking through them instead of to each other. Looking back, I also understand something about Richard. For years, I thought his nightly walks had been an escape. They weren't. They were an attempt to keep carrying his family without collapsing beneath the weight of his own grief. He just never found the words to explain that. Daniel almost repeated the same pattern. Not because he wanted secrets. because he believed protecting the people he loved meant protecting them from his pain. It's a mistake far more common than most of us realize. That's the lesson I carry from all of this. The real danger wasn't an abandoned garden. It wasn't 11 o'clock. It wasn't even the lie. The real danger was the quiet system we'd both slipped into. A system where love meant editing ourselves, where strength meant staying silent, where asking for help felt like failing the people who depended on us. That system doesn't break relationships all at once. It wears them down so slowly that you mistake distance for normal life. The night I followed my husband, I thought I was chasing a secret. Instead, I found a door that had been standing open for years. Neither of us had known how to walk through it. If you've listened this far, thank you for spending this time with me. Now I have a question for you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever misunderstood someone's silence, only to discover there was a completely different story behind it? And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Revenge Cold Stories, and I'll see you in the next one. The story ended there naturally. The final section already includes the long-term aftermath, Arthur's legacy, the final emotional resolution, the system metaphor lesson, the specific question for viewers, the required outro. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. There isn't a natural continuation after that without weakening the ending or turning it into a sequel. For a YouTube narration, this is the strongest stopping point because it delivers emotional closure and the audience takeaway. If your goal is a full 10, 000, 12, 000 word script, the better approach would be to expand the middle sections, more scenes from the garden, deeper backstory, additional family dynamics, more dialogue and slower packing, rather than continue after the ending. That preserves a satisfying narrative arc while reaching the target length.